David R. Guttery is the Chief Executive Officer of Keystone Financial Group in Trussville, Alabama. David Guttery and Seth Edgell are financial advisors who represent Emeritus Investment Company, LLC, and Emeritus Advisory Services. Please stay tuned through the end of the video for additional important disclosure information.
Hello, everyone. The format for today will be slightly different. Schedules just didn't mesh during the week of our country's 250th birthday, so I'm coming to you with a monologue today and an update on economic observations upon which we've opined throughout the year. Now, this might be a lengthy monologue, but I believe it'll be worth your time. In my opinion, the industrial side of the economy not only seems to be expanding, but accelerating, and it seems that the broader mass media would rather you be fixated on sensationalism. It's unfortunate that such good economic data is being overshadowed by the rhetoric of an election year. Is this deja vu all over again? We've seen this before. They who didn't profit from it the last time are likely to miss out again. So it would be a good idea to wade through the deafening cacophony of media, hyperbole, and rhetoric and examine most closely that which can be quantified on a spreadsheet. Remember, 2 + 2 = 4. Numbers don't care about your political persuasion. Spreadsheets are neither red nor blue, and very often they provide inarguable evidence that can provide a compelling path forward if you can be dispassionate enough to appreciate such data. So let's start with a recent and good example of spin versus truth. Last month we learned that consumer confidence set an all-time record low according to the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Survey. Images such as this went viral across platforms of social media, leaving you with the impression that we should all be down in the dumps and with a proverbial bag over our head. Indeed, consumer sentiment did post an all-time record low, and that would otherwise bother me, because on other occasions when we have seen such a reading, it was coincident with inflation hitting a 40-year high in the year of 2022, and a financial crisis in 2008, and when Paul Volcker and the policy-driven Federal Reserve Board kneecapped the economy in 1980. Typically, when consumers are feeling less confident, they circle the wagons, and they don't spend on discretionary items, and mainly consume only that which is necessary, like food, pharmaceuticals, healthcare utilities, and similar durable items. Generally, this also coincides with a recession, because consumerism is roughly 70% of gross domestic product. As we are going through these recessed periods of time, the stock market is also generally not a very positive place. So I find it interesting that while we notice an all-time record low in consumer sentiment, it is happening coincidentally with an all-time record high in the stock market. These two things should not coexist in the same universe. To me, this is like being dead and alive at the same time. It defies the logic of economic physics. So what's going on? Because something is either broken or horribly unusual. I did some digging into how the University of Michigan collects their data and how they analyze and assign weight to the collected points of data, and how such data is parsed across age, gender, ethnicity, and political ideology. This was the only smoking gun that I could find. According to the University of Michigan, there has never been a wider skew between input offered by Republicans and Democrats. If you're a Republican, it seems that you feel that we're in the roaring 20s. If you're a Democrat, it seems that you feel that we're in the middle of another Great Depression. The data is driven by political ideology, and it defies quantification on a spreadsheet. It does factor into the index, though. So at this time anyway, I think that we can discount what the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Survey is telling us. In other words, I believe this economy is much more about watch what I do rather than listen to what I say. So what are some examples of what we can glean by watching the actions of the consumer? Well, we just finished what turned out to be the best quarter in the history of tracking the data for positive earnings and revenue surprise reports. The average surprise to the upside was 20%. That's the orange bar on this graphic. In other words, on average, we were expecting to hear about $1 per share, and we learned that it was actually $1.20 per share. Obviously, for companies to have earnings and revenue, they must be selling you things. Well, they can't sell you things if you aren't buying things. Clearly, there is much consumerism going on, the sentiment survey notwithstanding. I have always felt that if you wanted a good, high-level proxy on the state of the economy, observe the banks. After all, everything starts and stops with leverage, correct? Within just the last few weeks, we've heard from Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, when he described the current market environment as being like a little tsunami. We also heard from Charles Scharf, the CEO of Wells Fargo. I believe that he packed a lot into a 6-word sentence. Things are still, meaning they remain and have been, and not just extremely, but extremely, extremely strong. You're not hearing that in the mass media right now, are you? So what could these leaders of major banks be describing? Possibly it is the U.S. industrial production, which remains at an all-time record high and continues to climb. Indeed, 2 weeks ago, we received fresh data indicating that this metric had risen by another 0.1%. We aren't just making things for the fun of it. We're making increasingly greater quantities of things to meet your demand that only continues to rise. I can cross-check that with the Institute of Supply Management and their manufacturing index. Any reading above 50 is indicative of expansion, while any reading below 50 is indicative of contraction. Earlier this year, we noticed that the ISM Manufacturing Index had shown the fastest rate of expansion over the last 3.5 years. Even the Wall Street Journal couldn't feign oblivion to this in February. Notice the far right of the graphic where seemingly we had an explosive jump back into expansion territory after muddling through about 1.5 years worth of contraction. Could it be that after a year's worth of impact under this new tariff strategy, repatriating manufacturing activity incentivized by the tariffs can now be quantified on a spreadsheet? Could be. Of course, the pushback is, come on, David, that's 1 point of data. 1 point of data doesn't make a trend. And I absolutely agree. How about 5? Not only does this seemingly form a trend in my mind, but it also appears to be gaining traction. And now, it's beginning to look eerily similar to the industrial economic activity that we observed in the year 2018. Now, this is important because of February 2019, 7 economic metrics had hit all-time record highs, including the ISM Manufacturing Index. He that feigns oblivion to this is likely doomed not to profit from it again. Indeed, I'm watching the regional manufacturing indices as well. Each of the 12 Federal Reserve districts has their own manufacturing PMI survey. This one is from Chicago at the beginning of June, and it showed the second largest month-over-month increase since February of 1967. I would say that this clearly indicates that manufacturing activity is not only expanding, but also accelerating. I'm reading articles about how factory output is now at a 4-year high as well. The Atlanta Federal Reserve, among other things, tracks employment data. The largest genre of employment is construction and mining. Now, there may be a few billionaires here, but every single trade union is represented in this genre of employment. Now, again, this is not a referendum on President Trump. This is simply an observation of data. Let's go back to Trump 1.0 and specifically the first 3 non-COVID years where wages increased for people in the construction and mining genre by an average of 6.8% per year for 3 straight years. Employees in this genre saw their wages grow by the fastest rate than under any other presidential administration in the history of the recorded data. An expanding manufacturing economy, where repatriating activity was incentivized by a tariff strategy, did indeed result in the greatest year-over-year wage increase that people in the largest genre of employment had ever seen. No wonder personal consumption and the velocity of money also hit record highs by February of 2019. So is this happening again today? It was just a few weeks ago that our local ABC affiliate here in Birmingham posted this story to their website. Construction jobs in the state of Alabama reached an 18-year high recently, and with record wages. Is this deja vu all over again? We've seen this before. I am reading articles that describe our trade deficit being at the lowest point that we've seen since 2009. To me, this implies that our exports are surging, driven by newly codified trade agreements with such countries as China, Japan, the UK, the EU, the Netherlands, among others. There is greater and greater demand for our exports, and because we are seemingly making more things here, our imports are declining. And as a result, the trade deficit is at a level that we haven't seen in over 17 years. To me, this is one of the most bullish referendums on the economy that I could give you, and yet, strangely, the media is silent on this. What's curious to me is that we are obviously making more things, but our capacity to make those things continues to remain flat, as evidenced by the capacity utilization rate index. So consider this bubble. I think this is a good metaphor for the state of the manufacturing economy right now. I believe that we are at, or very near, our current capacity to make things. Something's got to give. Why would manufacturers be reticent to expand the capacity of their plant to make things, to acquire capital equipment, to hire people? Well, if I make these things and the components are sourced from foreign vendors and subject to tariffs, I'm really not sure what my profit margin is next month, am I? And until I have greater clarity, I'm not going to be willing to spend money that I'm not sure I'm going to have to expand the capacity of my ability to make those things. That is, until I get clarity or I'm dragged kicking and screaming into having to doing so. So is there an example that we can reference from 2018 that might give us an indication of where we're going next? Yeah, I think jobless claims would be a good place to start. In February of 2018, we learned that jobless claims had hit a 45-year low. And again, that was after 2017. And questioning whether or not President Trump was an evil genius or had he lost his mind. Will tariffs act as a tax and cause the economy to shrink, or will it be the catalyst that leads to economic expansion? This point in time is important because beginning in March of 2018, we observed payroll gains moving in a positive direction, and they gained traction throughout the year until 2019, until when COVID shut everything down. So, do we observe a similar phenomenon today? Indeed, I believe we do. Between Labor Day of last year and the end of 2025, jobless claims had fallen like a rock. By this graphic, it does not appear that we were laying people off or firing people, and it sure doesn't appear that employees were quitting. Frankly, it appears that we were running our factories 24/7, 365 and paying a lot of people overtime in the process. By the end of last year, jobless claims were once again back to a 45-year low. 3 weeks ago, we learned that jobless claims stood at a level that we haven't seen since I've been born. That's a 57-year low. My Pelican brief to you is that I believe we are about to see an explosion in payroll gains. Driven by the same forces that were manifest in 2017, there is one glaring difference this time around, though, and that's the Federal Reserve itself. In July of last year, Chairman Powell was asked, "When are we going to get a rate cut out of you guys?" And his answer was salient. What do you do when you're driving in the fog? Slow down. If I were the Federal Reserve Chairman last year, I wouldn't have given you a rate cut either. At that time, we had not codified trade agreements with most of the countries that I mentioned earlier. We had tariffs and rumors of tariffs. For example, President Trump wanted to impose a 350% tariff on China. Well, the longer the tariffs linger, the more inflationary they become, and they act as a tax upon the economy. Well, by the Jackson Hole meeting later that year, the rhetoric obviously had changed. What changed? Well, we codified trading agreements with these partners, and that which was threatened up here, we agreed to down there. This was nebulous and opaque. This is clear and transparent. The language from the Fed changed. we can be more forward-looking in the adjudication of monetary policy. And since then, we have received 3 rate cuts from the Federal Reserve Board. Well, if the Fed's comfortable with what they see with regard to this new tariffing strategy, I wonder how closely behind private payrolls might be. Again, until recently, there was one additional unresolved metric here, and that is the Federal Reserve itself, specifically pertaining to leverage. Now, I know this graphic looks busy, and really, all that you need to know is that the larger the number, the less restrictive lending conditions are. If you notice at the beginning of 2025, we had an oppressive Federal Reserve Board, and the assumption was that rates would remain higher for longer and lending restrictions would be increasingly tighter. 1 year later, however, it would appear that we have a very accommodative Fed. Indeed, if you remove the black swan events of COVID and the financial crisis, I can argue that lending conditions haven't been this lucrative since 1988. I was a sophomore at the University of Alabama then. It's been a long time since we've seen lending conditions this lucrative. Now, I could spend an entire video talking about repo operations and reverse repo operations, but for today, let me just suffice to say that all of the money that the Federal Reserve took back from the lendable supply in 2022 has now been put back into the lendable supply of money through reverse repo operations. You can see that happening on this reverse repo budget graphic from the Federal Reserve. Starting in 2022, the Fed began to repo cash away from the banks, and it showed up in May of 23 as a deposit, if you will. What the media never told you was that beginning in May of 2023, reverse repo operations were underway, and by the end of last year, the Federal Reserve had nearly depleted their entire reverse repo budget. Well, if lending restrictions tighten as the amount of money in the lendable supply diminishes, then I suppose the opposite is true. With a record amount of money in the M2 money supply, I can surmise that lending restrictions relative to where they were are much more accommodative today than they were before. Furthermore, after 3 rate cuts, the secured overnight financing rate, which is the rate that member banks charge each other for overnight lending, is also the basis of the prime rate, and it's now back to a level that we haven't seen in 3.5 years. So hang on just a minute. Let's connect some dots. Industrial production's at an all-time record high and climbing. Factory output is at a 4-year high. The ISM Manufacturing Index is expanding by the fastest rate we've seen in 3.5 years. The trade deficit is back to a level that we haven't seen since 2009. The Federal Reserve is as accommodative as they've been since 1988. There's more money to lend than ever before in the history of the banking system, and it cost me less to borrow that money than it has at any time in the last 3.5 years, while I am bursting at the seams trying to keep up with your demand that only continues to rise. What do you think happens next? In my opinion, I believe we are on the cusp of seeing significant payroll gains as the compulsion to expand manufacturing activity becomes irresistible. Clearly, more people working and earning an income is a positive thing. With that income, customers go to Walmart and they buy these things. Well, if I make them, I've got to produce 2 to put back on the shelf. That's the positive feedback loop that we saw in 2018 too, and it led to 7 economic metrics hitting all-time record highs by February of 2019. Again, in spite of the deafening media rhetoric, I would caution everyone, regardless of political ideology, to remember that those who feigned oblivion to the spreadsheet the last time probably missed out on the opportunities that were available. In my opinion, we've got a second opportunity not to make the same mistake twice. I believe that we are seeing on this chart the struggle going on. It's been going on for about a year now with manufacturers with regard to employment. It reminds me a lot of market capitulation. You see this sometimes when the market is establishing a new high or struggling to find footing after a drawdown. It is this curious, choppy, volatile pattern as the market struggles to find bottom or wrestles with what's proving to be a top just in advance of what could be a leg down or a leg up. In this case, I sense that employers are struggling with the increasingly greater demands brought by your patterns of consumption as they navigate the challenges of tariffs and cost of borrowing. Is the Federal Reserve my friend or my enemy? Well, we just bombed Iran. Oil went up 100%. The CPI went from 2.2 to 4.2. Does that mean the Federal Reserve is about to increase rates and thus my borrowing costs? Are tariffs in front of us or behind us? Do I hire? Do I not? Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. Do you see the pattern? Notice that an interesting trend is seemingly developing just since October of last year in a discernibly positive way. What I'm looking for at this point are positive surprises in employment reports. Snapback employment. We would have hired these people by now were it not for the opacity of tariffs and the uncertainty with regard to the Federal Reserve. One thing the media forgot to tell you was that in the month of May, we set a new record for new monthly hires if you take the COVID pandemic out. Sure enough, in the most recent employment report, we learned that we created 172,000 new private payrolls, and the reports for both of the previous 2 months were revised higher by 50,000 payrolls each. So in total, we learned of 272,000 new private payrolls when the consensus economic expectation called for an increase of only 65,000 jobs. Surprise! That's the positive surprise for which I was looking, and it reminds me very much of the employment pattern that we observed in 2018 as the economy gained traction quickly, propelling us into 2019 before COVID shut everything down. So again, in spite of what the media would have you believe and the University of Michigan, it is obvious that consumer demand is pushing the discernibly positive economic data. Again, we're not making things for the fun of it. Clearly, your demand is driving the response from manufacturing. And maybe that stronger demand is being driven by more people earning a higher income as evidenced by these better than expected employment gains that are eerily reminiscent of what we saw in the first half of 2018. So aside from that, what else can we glean about consumer patterns of behavior? Well, it would appear that we can't travel to Europe fast enough. This slide is a little dated, but the trend continues to expand. The percent of country planning a foreign vacation in the next 6 months continues to climb. At the end of May, we learned that hotel rates were hitting all-time record highs, driven by that demand for travel. Meanwhile, Polo Ralph Lauren hit 3 all-time record highs last year. It appears to me that we are traveling to Paris for 2 weeks, paying record high rates for accommodations while wearing a Polo Ralph Lauren quarter zip. These are not patterns of discretionary behavior. That you just don't see this when you're struggling to put beans on the table. As most of you know, I am a fan of the Alabama Crimson Tide. Last year, the Indiana Hoosiers beat my Crimson Tide by a historic margin in the college football playoffs. I was so impressed by that drubbing that I became an Indiana fan for the remainder of the season. Why not? Let's see if Cinderella can pull it off, right? I get it. It's been 100 years since Indiana played for the national championship, but good grief, somebody paid over $3,400 to watch that game with the pigeons in the nosebleed section in the top of the end zone. According to SeatGeek, that game set the record for the highest premium ever paid for a single ticket to a college national football championship game. Not to be outdone, the Super Bowl also set a record for the highest premium paid for a single ticket to that game. The New York Knicks, they haven't played for an NBA championship since 1974, so I get it. It's been a long time. But Game 3 in Madison Square Garden set the record for premium prices paid to an NBA championship final game. The cheapest ticket in the house was $10,600. Here's the point. We had a college football championship game and a Super Bowl game and an NBA championship game in the year 2022 also. But we didn't hear about record ticket prices being paid back then, though, did we? Then again, inflation was at a 40-year high. Consumers were circling the wagons, and hence, maybe why we didn't set records for premium paid for tickets to those games. Maybe we set those records recently because the economy is indeed stronger than the mass media would like for you to believe, and there is a greater proportion of consumers with discretionary income enough to consume the things that they don't need, like tickets to ball games and so forth. How about Live Nation? They just announced for a second quarter in a row record revenue from concert goers. Again, I love the Eagles just as much as anyone else, but you don't pay $500 for one ticket to see them at the Sphere if you can't put bread on the table. Nothing of what I can put on a spreadsheet is consistent with the thought that the economy is contracting and that consumers are dour and down in the dumps. If anything, it points in the opposite direction. Shiny, happy people with smiles on their face and discretionary income in their pockets consume more foreign travel. Record high accommodation prices, luxury items like Polo Ralph Lauren shirts and tickets to national championship football games and basketball games and concerts. Lastly, I will point to oil production, and no, this has nothing to do with President Trump. Oil production would not be at an all-time record high if demand for the commodity weren't also at an all-time record high. Demand pushes production. I have never seen an economy recess when oil demand was at an all-time record high. So in conclusion, I am persuaded by what I can quantify on a spreadsheet. The sentiment and the hyperbole of the media will only become louder between now and the end of November, and hardly any of it can seemingly be supported or justified by data on a spreadsheet. If you truly want actionable intelligence, you're not getting it from the broader mass media. If there was ever a time to look more deeply than just the surface, it's now. This is what should drive exposure to economic sectors and the stocks of companies that reside within those sectors. So in closing, as I've said on many, many occasions, this should all be driven by a comprehensive plan for the management of wealth. This is where a financial planning professional can help you wade through the noise of the day and implement a plan that is focused on the achievement of goals. Now, for additional information, I can be reached through the means listed on the following screen. For Keystone Financial Group and the Trustful Tribune, I'm David Guttery.
David Guttery and Seth Edgell independently offer securities and investment advisory services through Emeritus Investment Company, LLC, member FINRA, SIPC, and Emeritus Advisory Services. Information provided in today's segments is gathered from sources believed to be reliable. However, its accuracy cannot be guaranteed and should not be interpreted as tax or legal advice. Any performance stated is past performance and is not indicative of future results.